So this video begins on page 75 of the play Blood Brothers. We are still early in Act 2. Now, we talked quite a lot about how at the end of Act 1 and at the beginning of Act 2 we have this increasing sense of optimism. It seems as if life for the characters are improving. The Lyons seem to have escaped to the country. The Johnstones seem to have escaped to the country similarly. We have this idea that physical distance can somehow symbolically help them to escape the consequences of their actions. However, we also said that within that there were the seeds of future problems. There were hints that foreshadow that this is not a play that ends well, that remind us that a tragic outcome is still the likelier event. First of all, of course, you have the reference to Sammy, to his increasing criminality. Remember, we said that that was going to be important in the play as it builds up to his eventual manslaughter, the fact that he kills a man in the botched robbery later on. That's one item then that foreshadows the future. Similarly, of course, if both the Lyons and the Johnstones thought that a move to the country could allow them to escape the consequences of their actions, the fact that in the previous section the two boys were reunited, met again by what seems like a coincidence, but of course has to be fate, if we're thinking about this again as a tragedy, that too foreshadows that end, not least because of that sort of fateful prophecy that Mrs. Lyons made when she said right at the beginning that if either twin were to see the other again, they would both immediately die. Her words. Of course, that's an invented sort of superstition, but in terms of the play as a tragedy, we can very much see how structurally that is going to take place. One final thing that's worth mentioning about is the fact that that fateful reunion there, such an important moment in the boys' lives, as we've said previously, so many of these most fateful moments are coloured by Russell's use of the sparse, of the humour, and particularly in the episode where Edward explains to Mickey how to talk to a girl, I think in particular are very amusing, and again sort of distract slightly from the seriousness of this moment. So we'll continue then now in the section where the boys are about to see Mrs. Johnstone and then to go to the cinema. So we see Mrs. Johnstone in her kitchen as Mickey bursts in, followed by Edward. Once again, of course, notice the fluid Brechtian use of space, the way that the stage is transformed. One moment they're out in the country, the next moment wheel on a prop, wheel on a flat wall, and we're in Mrs. Johnstone's kitchen. Again, if we're talking about the way that Willie Russell is subverting the idea of a tragedy, remember in tragedy the unity of space that says that the stage must represent one place. Well, in Russell, in Brechtian drama, not only does the space represent multiple locations, but often almost at the same time in the way that they fluidly interlock. So, we begin. Mother, ma'am, look, it's Eddie. Mrs. Johnstone stands looking at Edward and smiling, of course, at being reunited with her lost son. And he says, "Hiya, Mrs. Johnstone, isn't it fantastic? We're neighbours again." Now, there is dramatic irony once again. This looks happy, but we know, fatefully, that it's not going to end well. All the more so, of course, because we've seen the tableau at the beginning. We've heard of the prologue. We know that what the ending will be. So that even as we dare to hope for something happier, we know that this is all pointing back towards that tragic end. Mickey continues, Mum, Eddie lives in that house, that big house on the hill. Mum, can you lend us £1 to go to the pictures? Oh yes, it's in the sideboard. Now, symbolically, it's interesting to note that Mrs. Johnstone, who was very poor earlier in the play, now has money to spare. Again, leads to this superficial improvement in her fortunes that we've talked about. He says, "Oh, thanks, ma'am, I love you," and he exits to the next room, leaving Edward alone. He says, "You're looking very well, Mrs Johnstone." "Am I? Do you still keep that locket I gave you?" "Of course. Look." And Mickey enters back in again. Now again, in terms of that interaction, you have to think about the different ways that it would play to different characters. Edward, of course, thinks of it merely as a symbol of friendship. Of course, Mrs Johnstone knows that actually it's a symbol of the secret bond that she shares with him, of course, as her lost son. So, continuing then, Mickey says, Ma'am, can I bring Eddie back afterwards for coffee?" "Yeah, go on and enjoy yourselves, but don't be too late, will you?" Again, the idea of, sort of social things like having someone around for coffee. Again, it's a symbol of having a little bit of money to spare, a little bit of leisure time. We see again it as a symbol of how their life has improved. He says, "See you, ma'am." Edward replies, "Bye, Mrs Johnstone." Again, if you're looking for at any point ever quotations to use juxtapose the nature of their characters as revealed by the different formality of the different register of their speech, that's quite a good little pair. The boys prepare to leave. Mrs Johnstone says, "Hey, what's the film you're going to see?" What? What film?" And then, again now, in another kind of comedic moment, they reply together with two different answers, Dr. Zhivago and the Magnificent Seven. Dr. Zhivago being a sort of romance set against the background of the Russian Revolution by Boris Pasternak. The book was by the novelist Boris Pasternak. The Magnificent Seven being a cowboy western film. To which she, more amusingly, plays along and replies, "Dr. Zhivago's Magnificent Seven." Now there would be a kind of a mash-up film to see. Edward says it's a double bill. Mrs Johnstone says, I see. And where's it on? She obviously knows and is playing along with the fact that they're not saying. The boys reply, "What? The Asoldo," the name of the cinema. Mrs Johnstone gives the kind of punchline now to this little humorous, this little sparse episode, and says, "Oh, the Asoldo, eh? When I passed the Asoldo this morning, they were showing Nymphomaniac Nights and Swedish Au Pairs." And so we discover that actually she knew all along what it was that they were going to see. Now, Edward then replies, "Ah, yes, Mrs Johnstone, yes, yeah, they're just the trailers, a documentary and a travelogue about Sweden." Travelogue as in a sort of travel documentary. She says, "Do you think, the pair of you really think I was born yesterday?" Edward can't hold it any longer and breaks into embarrassed laughter. Mickey tries to hold on and says, it's just a travelogue. And she says, "Showing the spectacular bends and curves of Sweden." "Go on, you randy little sods." Bends of curves, of course, she's talking about presumably these naked women, which we'd best not dwell on here. Mickey is shocked that she would talk to him in that way, is scandalised, and says, "Mother!" And she says, "Go on, before I throw a bucket of water over the pair of you." Mickey drags Edward out, and she shouts after them, "I don't know about coffee, you'd be better off with bromide." She gets on with her work. Now the joke there being then that bromide, as well as being a chemical, was a drug which is supposed to sort of calm the sex drive. It's supposed to be like a tranquilizer. Now there was a rumour, sort of common urban myth, that they used to give it to soldiers in their tea, oddly enough, as a way supposedly of making them less likely to go raping and pillaging around the countryside during the kind of mid-20th century. Bob, I don't know whether that's true, but that's bromide. Now, a quick point before we go on. We see here Mrs Johnstone, the tolerant mother, the kind mother, but you might also argue perhaps the indulgent or the over-indulgent mother, perhaps giving them too much freedom. Let's face it, these two boys are 14, and she is tolerating the idea that they're going to go to a public cinema together to see a pair of porn films. Just a quick note on that, not quite as bizarre at the time as it might seem. Obviously, people didn't have access to video players or DVD players or obviously not computers or the internet. And so actually there was a thing, in fact in Soho in London particularly, there were specialist cinemas, I believe, that only used to actually show porn films. But presumably the implication here is that other ones would do it at certain times of the day or something like that. But anyway, so it's not quite as bizarre as it seems to us, although let's be honest, still pretty bizarre. Anyway, the two boys move outside, and outside the house, looking back, Edward says, "She's fabulous, your ma, isn't she?" Presumably, of course, looking at how relaxed she is compared to the uptight Mrs. Lyons. And Mickey, another punchline, says, "She's a fucking head case. Come on." And off they go. Now, another important scene then about to begin here, because as they run off, we see Mrs. Lyons appear from where she has been concealed in the alley. Now think about that. The implication then that she has been following her own son around, the implication that she doesn't trust him, she's so terrified by the guilt that haunts her on the basis of her earlier actions that she is prepared to actually follow them. Seems quite shocking, but there we are. Now Mrs. Johnstone is lilting or singing or humming the "We Go Dancing" line as she appears in the kitchen. Now that's significant because, again, the idea of dancing for Mrs. Johnstone is always associated with this idea of happiness and escapism. It's linked to the sense in which she seems to feel that she is, as it were, free and that she is happy. But of course there's an element here, however unfortunate, of hubris, because of course we know that that her happiness is not going to last. Mrs. Johnstone gets a shock as she looks up and sees Mrs. Lyons there. The two women stare at each other. Now we'll pause it there for this video and we'll resume this scene in the next one.